Alright, so we spent all of last week talking about one entire sensory system, and that system was vision. Now, why did we spend an entire week on that? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cram every other single sensory system that you have into 1 week, right? The reason we pulled vision out is a couple reasons. One, we are highly visual species. We really are. If you don't believe me, how many of you file your taxes? Yeah, so Zane, you file your taxes, right? When you look on there, it gives you a box if you're legally blind. It doesn't give you one if you're deaf, or if you can't smell, or if you can't taste, right? So we clearly value vision, not just with the IRS, but as a species, right? Okay, so we really are a highly visual species. We're not rats, we're not bats, we're not smelling or hearing our ways around the world, right? So it's a different experience. So vision. The other thing, because your retina was so readily accessible, right? And it has been readily accessible for a couple centuries now, right? If we think about how long the ophthalmoscope's been around, we've been able to study the visual system much more easily than we have those other senses, right? And whatever we've learned about vision, we've been able pretty easily, Alex, to transfer that over to the other senses, make a few adjustments based on that particular system, but the same basic principles apply with just a couple twists here and there, right? So it's kind of easy for us to do this. So we'll talk about audition, we'll talk about the vestibular system. That's a fun one, if you've ever fallen down. It's for balance. We'll talk about your somatosenses. I do want to right now make certain that you don't leave this class and tell people you have 5 senses. Because you don't. You probably have who knows how many. I don't want to count them, okay? So we all know vision, audition. You don't think about balance, but there's an extra one, right? Vestibular system. That's taste, smell, and then your somatosenses. We really, we think about touch, but touch is really separate systems, right? Because we didn't think about pain, we didn't think about temperature. Tickle. Tickle's a fun one. No pun intended. You've got touch, vibration, texture. I mean, you can really sort of break these down. You've got receptors for pressure. That kind of goes into touch. So you've got all kinds of somatosenses, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. Skip these learning objectives. It's a lot. All right. Last week we talked about the primary visual cortex, which is sort of back in this area. Okay. So that's a primary sensory cortex. It's going to be handling only vision. The primary auditory cortex is only going to be handling information that is coming from your ears, right? Primary somatosensory cortex, we're handling those somatosenses. Primary olfactory cortex, gustatory cortex, smell and taste, right? But we do have association cortical areas, right? A bunch of those are up in the parietal lobe. These are areas where we're going to start blending together the senses so we can create this nice coherent experience, right? When we think about an experience, we think about our movements through the world, we're not taking individual senses, dealing with each one of those independently. We're dealing with all of those together, right? I love this first one here. Zane, this is just for you. Just in case you didn't know it, we hear sounds. You're welcome. I know, right?
Appreciate it.
You've learned something. Go ahead and leave. You've reached your peak learning for the day. So, just in case some of you didn't realize it, Calvin, we hear sounds. Right? It's a real shock. What happens? An object vibrates. Not a big deal. It moves molecules of air. These waves travel really fast, somewhere around 1,200 kilometers per hour. That's the speed of sound. I am required at this point, Sydney, to ask you, because this is a pass-fail question for your entire degree. They will not give you your degree if you don't know the answer to this. I'm required to ask you, do you know who broke the sound barrier first?
He's from Logan.
That's something. We'll at least let you come to graduation. We're not going to let you walk. It's Chuck Yeager, right? You guys know Chuck Yeager. So there you go. And he did that in the Bell X1, right? Just out there, that's important for you guys. Sort of local history, right? These vibrations, they occur somewhere around 30 to 20,000 times per second. They're going to come in, and we have what we call inner hair cells. Not a big deal. In our ears, right? In our inner ear. These guys are going to end up getting vibrated, and they're going to take those vibrations. Hey, who remembers that thing called sensory transduction? They're going to take those vibrations and turn that into that electrical signal that our brains can interpret, right? It's a pretty cool process. Here you go. Here's a speaker. You have air. It's going to be compressed or rarefied, which is expanded, right? So it's kind of decompressed. These sound waves come in. You've got this big thing hanging on the side of your head. You've got one on each side. It's called the pinna, right? Also known as the outer ear, your eyeglass holder, right? Okay, some of you call it that. Nobody's heard that. That's going to funnel your sound in through the ear canal, or the auditory meatus, for those of you who love those fun words. Those sound waves are going to beat upon what we call the tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. You can see one of the three auditory ossicles, or ear bones. Those guys are going to get vibrated. They're going to punch around on the cochlea, right? That's going to shake some jelly in there called the endolymph. That endolymph is going to vibrate out. Hair cells are going to move in certain locations. We're going to let some ion channels open up. Ions are going to come in. We're going to fire action potentials. And guess what? You just heard something. Sounds exciting. How many of you wear earbuds? How many of you wear earbuds? Because you're going to lose your hearing soon. Just yelling it at you. Worst thing you can do for your hearing, to be honest. You know why? Evolution gave you an outer ear. Apple gave you an ear pod, right? You know what they're going to be selling next? Hearing aids. They're devious like that. I know this is coming. So, because this is exactly what I would have thought of. I've been telling people for years, earbuds are a bad idea, right? They're a bad idea. Get the over the ear, you're fine. Make use of that pinna, right? Don't get the in the ear stuff. Okay, bad idea. I've been telling people this. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, looking through my news feed, wouldn't you know it, someone wrote an article in the New York Times about how you are going to lose your hearing sooner than people older than you. So look forward for that, Riley. It's not too late. Probably is. Yeah, so you got to use that pinna. I would recommend using it. It's there for a reason. It's there to attenuate and funnel sounds and get that in so you can hear things. All right, so if we're thinking about stimulus, again, this is going to be sound waves. Words we're going to use, pitch, right? That's going to be the frequency of that vibration. You know, how many waves per second. We're going to measure that in hertz, right? Something is a high pitch, that's a high frequency, right? So think like Alvin and the Chipmunks. Okay, you guys know Alvin and the Chipmunks, right? Somebody does. If you're thinking a low pitch, think of like Barry White, right? If you guys don't know Barry White, you're missing out on about 2/3 of what your life should be. So I would recommend sticking that, again, over the ear, or get you some nice speakers at home, not ear pods. Barry White was not meant for in the ear earbuds, I promise. All right, how loud something is, we're thinking about intensity. Again, amplitude, right? Higher from top to bottom on that wave, the louder it's going to be. Then there's some information, or something called timbre. Timbre's sort of confusing. When we think about sound waves, we're going to think about a nice sine wave, right? You guys remember that from geometry? We have these nice sine waves. Okay, that's going to tell us what our frequency is. It's going to give us our amplitude. It's going to give us a lot of information, Cindy. But in reality, in the real world, sounds are not pure tones, right? They're not one single sound wave. There are going to be other sound waves riding on top of that. So they're going to be kind of mixed, right? Some of my favorite examples, I like to talk about music, right? So if you think about how many of you play the trumpet? Anybody a trumpet? Yeah, hey, how about that? So you play the trumpet, right, Cameron? You used to, right? So when you played the trumpet, what was your favorite note? High C. There you go, right? So you're playing this high C on your trumpet, right? And then you have a friend who plays a different instrument, right? I assume. Okay, what instrument was that? Like the clarinet? Yeah. Okay, great. So can they play a high C on a clarinet? Of course, right? I mean, you could play it on anything, right? Now, if you hear the high C on the trumpet, and you're going to play it just as loud as your friend playing the high C on the clarinet, they're the same frequency, right? Because they're the same note. They're the same intensity because they're the same loudness. Are they going to sound the same? Of course not. One's a trumpet, one's a clarinet, right? That's what we're talking about with timbre. Okay? That's the other small sound waves riding that main frequency, right? That are going to make it unique. They're going to make it a clarinet. They're going to make it a trumpet. Okay? It's the timbre. Here's a nice graphic representation of that. Again, here's Alvin. This is Dave. Wasn't that Alvin's dad when he would yell all the time? I thought that was his name. So that's kind of loud. I don't know. And who whispers? I don't know. This is going to be like a creepy whisperer. Okay. This is a nice, simple tone. So if you want to think about how many of you have like a ringtone, right? You have like a, you know, that chime, right? And this is a more complex, it's like a trumpet, right? So it's going to have those other sound waves riding on that. Gives it that unique character. If this was a clarinet, it would look almost identical, but it would just be a little different, right? So maybe in a few places it's a little higher, a little lower. Most of the main peaks and valleys are going to match, but that the little stuff on top of it. We call that harmonics. That's a little advanced for most of you, but there it is if you need to know it. All right, let's think about the anatomy of the ear a bit, because we want to think about how we're getting this sound in. You've got that nice big outer ear called the pinna. Interestingly, it's shaped in such a way to specifically help you hear sound frequencies that match human speech. Human speech is probably one of the most important sounds that you will ever hear, right? Much more important than this, like, you know, HVAC rattling, right? Or the click of your shoes as you go down the hall, right? Probably someone trying to convey important information to you, right, through human speech. Sound waves come in. Again, they're going to beat on that tympanic membrane. We've got the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. For those of you not really into the Latin, that's the mallet or hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. The point of these guys is to add some extra leverage, right? Because you're transitioning here from air to, when you get inside the cochlea, it's called endolymph. It's sort of a gelatinous substance, right? So it's kind of this jelly that you've got to vibrate, so that's harder, right? How many of you have ever punched through air? That's pretty awesome, right? How many of you ever punched through water? That's a lot harder, right? So you're transitioning from these two. How many of you have ever punched from air right into water? That hurts, right? Because you're switching media quickly, okay? So that's what we're doing here. We need a little help with that. Otherwise, all of these sound waves would come right in, and they just bounce right back out as soon as they hit that endolymph, okay? If we don't have that extra sort of leverage. We're going to send those vibrations around through the cochlea. Kind of looks like a snail. Vibration is going to match some particular position on that cochlea. You don't need to know too much about that. And then it's going to activate your inner hair cells. We already talked about all of these guys. How about that? This is inside your cochlea. Okay. Got a couple membranes here. Don't worry about it too much. The important part is the inner hair cell. And this guy has these things called cilia that are going to stick up into this other membrane. When those vibrations come through your cochlea, they're going to shift these cells and these cilia back and forth. Okay? And it's going to cause the cilia to move. It's going to rip open ion channels. Positive ions are going to come in. We can create an action potential, send that out through the auditory nerve, and we're going to send that back to primary auditory cortex eventually. Some other things we do first. How many of you are familiar with cochlear implants? Okay. Cochlear implants bypass the cochlea, right? Basically, you've put a microphone on the outside of the head. You're collecting in those sound waves. We know the frequency of those sound waves, and then we can stimulate the correct auditory nerves for those frequencies and send some electrical information through to the auditory cortex. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. That only works for people who have problems with their cochlea. If you have a hearing deficit because of some other reason, a cochlear implant will not help you.
I don't have the nerve in the left ear. Like everything's in there except the nerve, so they can't do that in a sense.
There you go. It's not a problem with the cochlea. You've got a cochlea. You just don't have the nerve. If you don't have the nerve, there's nothing there for us to stimulate, right? You could always just put copper wires in there, though.
Oh yeah, we'll try that. They tried to do the hearing aids that like take sound from the side to put in that, but that
Right.
doesn't work. Then you have all the sound in one side.
Yeah, that's a little confusing, right? Because then you're always just turning in a circle.
Yeah. Which I do anyway, because I can't tell where stuff's coming from.
Right. It's interesting. Do you find yourself sitting on one side of the class or the other? Do you always put your... Do you ever think about that? You probably don't.
No, I can't. I have to be facing. Like if I was turned around, no matter what side you were on, I wouldn't really be able to hear you very well. Because like, I don't know why. I think I read lips more than I realize. Because if I face people, I can understand them super easy. But if they're right here, even like behind me, and the ear I can hear out of, and they're talking, it's really hard for me to understand.
That's interesting. So there you go. Now I'm going to duck behind the screen and see.
Just cover your mouth. Like
Yeah.
that.
See if that helps.
No.
All right. Don't worry about this too much. Although we do want to think about hair cells, particularly the inner hair cells. These are the receptive cells of the auditory apparatus. This is similar to the rods and cones that we talked about in the retina, right? That were catching photons. These guys are catching sound waves. That's really all you need to think about, right? It's not so bad. Now we have things called outer hair cells. That's why I've been important stressing the inner hair cells. The outer hair cells are involved in something called gain control. This is sort of a complex topic that applies to sensory systems that we may not really go into. So for those of you who are interested in gain control, it's pretty awesome. Basically what happens is the signal coming in your ear goes up to your brain, and your brain says, hey, I'm getting some sound at this frequency and amplitude, and it sends information back down to your auditory, your inner hair cells to tune those guys so they can be ready for that particular sound frequency, right? So it's kind of a cool thing. It explains why we have such a broad range of frequencies and amplitudes that we can hear, but each cell is only tuned to a narrow band, right, at any given time. So we can hear, a huge range of sound, but we can only hear in a small sort of segment at any given moment. It's just, it just makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, How many tires do you have for your car? 4. Why? 5. Some people have 5. Those are the people who are adults and really prepared for the future. Some of you are like, 4. You got to have a spare tire. You got to have a spare tire.
I don't even think I have a spare. I think like Nissan cheaped out, just gave me one of the little donuts for my SUV.
It is a tire. I mean, it is a tire.
That you can only go like 35 miles an hour on it. Only rated for like 10 miles. No.
She's really upset about that.
I am. Very upset.
My brother just bought a car. He had to pay extra to get a spare tire. He had to like order it separately. They just gave him like an inflator kit. And I thought, well, that works if you ran over a nail, but that doesn't work if you had a blowout, right? Like, how are you going to inflate nothing? I was thinking about this. And I was like, but at least he was like smart enough to like actually buy the spare tire, which he bought before he even bought the car. That was weird, but whatever. It's like I know I'm getting this car, but I'm going to buy this spare tire ahead of time anyway. So you can use like 4 tires at a time, right? So why have 10 tires? There's no point in that. That's wasteful, right? So you can only hear so much at a time. You got so many cells. We're just trying to be efficient here, right? Give you as much sensitivity in that range. If somebody's whispering to you, you're probably also not like listening to a jet takeoff, right? So there's no point being able to be tuned specifically for something really loud and something really soft simultaneously, so we can kind of move up and down. Also, we can do that with frequencies. Yeah, don't worry about this too much. This is kind of interesting, the cilium and the tip link, right? So the tip link is what connects those cilia. So they look like this, and then they're connected. And that way when the cilia swing one way, they'll stretch. And what you'll actually have right here is an ion channel. And this guy's going to grab onto it, and they'll rip it open, and then ions can flood in. Okay? So previously we talked about ion channels being opened with what we called ligand gated, right? We talked about them opening because of neurotransmitters. This guy's opening because of a mechanical situation, right? So that's kind of cool. It's different. Let's see. We already talked about this. Interesting thing about your cochlea is if you were to unroll it, some parts of it are more responsive to high frequencies and some are more responsive to low frequencies, right? That's based on the rigidity of the membrane at that time. This is one of the reasons why the first, assuming you've not done something else like an idiot and, used earbuds, assuming you're just going through life at a normal pace, high frequencies are the first sort of hearing loss that you see, right? Or that you have as an older adult. The reason for that is the high frequency portion of your cochlea is kind of brittle, right? And those cells are more easily damaged in that portion, right? And that portion of the cochlea is more easily damaged. So those are going to be damaged first. Most people, unless they work in a particular environment where there are constantly low frequency sounds, are not going to lose low frequency hearing, right? That's not going to happen. It's going to be the high frequencies that fall out first. As a theft deterrent, some stores, I think Walmart used to do this when I was in graduate school, where I lived. The Walmart would play high frequency sounds in the shoe section. Apparently that particular Walmart had a rash of young kids coming in late at night and stealing shoes. So what they would do is they would play this really annoying high frequency noise to keep the young kids out of the shoe section. The old people who went in there to buy shoes couldn't hear it, so they were just like, all right, I'm fine, I'm just going to buy my, non-slip workforce shoes or what. I don't know what Walmart sells. I have no idea in their shoe section. But the young folks who would go in, they would be like, wow, that's an annoying noise. So there you go. I'm thinking about getting a high-frequency sound generator for my office. The problem is I think I can still hear it, but I'm just going to have it facing out to keep the young, annoying students away. That sounds like a good one, right? But then, the old people in my department will still come bother me. We've got to find some way to deter them as well. hey, guess who's been telling you about transduction in hair cells for like 10 minutes? And then here's a slide about it. This is the cilia, this is the tip link. If they lean toward the short ones, there's no tension there, right? So we're not going to be ripping open ion channels. If they lean this way, then we're more likely to rip open these channels, right? We have ions that enter. A little bit different. Normally we think about sodium coming in. In this case, we got to think about potassium and calcium. Okay, so slightly different ions. Same story though, right? We don't really care which ions are coming in. As long as they're positive or negative, we'll know what's happening, right? In this case, we've got positive ions coming in, so we're going to create an action potential. Who remembers that visual system? We went I, LGN, V1, and we were all happy, right? The auditory system's a little different. You go from ear, it's not a kidney, that's an ear, and you do this about 12 times, and then you're back to auditory cortex. It is a very confusing pathway. And Sarah, the reason for that is because we're taking information, trying to take information from both sides, right, both ears. We can compare the arrival time of those, and that can help us determine where things are located, right? If you hear something sooner in one ear, you're going to think it's farther on that side, right? If you hear something sooner in the other ear, then it's on that side. So here's that really confusing pathway that I'm not going to expect you to memorize, okay? What I do want you to know is we are comparing information from left side to right side, and that helps us with localization, right? Again, not going to ask you about most of this. Who remembers that the dorsal lateral geniculate nucleus, right? With vision, this is the medial geniculate nucleus. So we're moving in a little bit in the thalamus. We're going to handle auditory information there, okay? This is showing you what we call the frequency to place code, or tonotopic mapping. We did not really talk much about retinotopic mapping. I didn't specifically mention that in the retina. If you were to take the visual world, Jakia, and we've mapped that onto our retina, we knew that, right? And then we're just going to continue that mapping all the way back to cortex. So if I go into your visual cortex and I stimulate part of it that represents this piece of the world, you'll think you see something there, right? Okay? And I can move around and do the same thing, right? Auditory cortex is organized differently. It's not organized based on location. It's organized based on frequency or tone. Okay? So, the cochlea is organized such that higher frequencies are in that brittle part, lower frequencies are out toward the end. That mapping is going to continue in to your auditory and secondary auditory cortex, your primary and secondary auditory. Okay. I think that's the projector. Does anybody else notice it vibrates? All right, here's your auditory cortex. I'm not going to ask you much about that. Most of it's out here in the temporal lobe. You've got some information in some other places. We will talk a bit more about auditory cortex and some areas in the front and in the back here when we start to talk about human communication. When we talk about Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, we talk about some of these other issues with understanding spoken words, written words, things like that. We'll also talk about stuttering and some other things. We'll revisit this idea of the auditory cortex at that time. There's the cochlear implant. Some of them look a bit different than this one. This is a little bit of an older image. You can see, again, you've got sort of a microphone device on the outside of the head. It's going to send that information in to the auditory nerve. Because of that tonotopic organization, we know which fibers are supposed to carry which frequency, and we can stimulate those particular fibers. It's pretty cool. So your brain knows which frequency is being received. Don't worry too much about this. In terms of localizing sounds, again, we're going to rely on that arrival time, right? That from both ears. That helps us. We can also think about intensity differences, right? If you hear something more intensely in one ear than the other, the source of the sound's probably closer to the more intense ear, right? So for those of you in the front, my voice is probably a bit louder than to those of you in the back, right? Because there's some loss in intensity over distance, right? We could calculate that if you wanted. I don't think that's probably worth your time.
The only bad part that I find about being deaf is like in one ear is you don't know where something's coming from. It's like somebody's talking to me, I don't know where they're at, or they like randomly say my name. I'm like, I don't know where you are. No clue. Just complain all the time.
That's okay. No, I was going to give you time.
Okay.
It's an educational complaint. Some people just complain, and it's not worth anything to me. See, tired. If you wanted to complain about being tired, you know, in 2 weeks, that would be. that's like 5 weeks. You can complain about being hungry when we talk about ingestive behaviors. So right now, I'm only letting people voice complaints about sensory systems, hearing. You know, that's going to end soon, so you need to get that done.
One more thing then. Okay.
Okay.
You know in the 90s when you would lose your phone and then you would have to hit the button and find the beeping sound?
Yeah.
Find where the thing is? Well, that happened all the time, and my mom would hit the button and make me find the beep. You know how hard that was? I still have like nightmares having to find the beeping noise. I don't know where it's at.
That just seems kind of mean.
It was so bad.
I think I probably wouldn't get her anything for Mother's Day.
Yeah. It was.
I mean, my mother didn't do that to me, and I still don't get her anything for Mother's Day.
I'm 30 and I'm still not over it.
Are we doing taste today? Drinking under taste?
No. Not the act of drinking. If something's already in your mouth, you can complain about that. Keep trying, Chris. You'll get there.
I'm gonna get one.
All right. There's sound localization. We talked about it. Complex sounds. Whoa, this is fun. This is going to be damage to auditory cortex. So we've sort of talked about different kinds of hearing deficits. Some of that can be related to what we call conduction, like getting the sound in. Some of it can be related to translating that sound into your auditory system, your auditory cortex. Then there are what they call like central auditory processing disorders, right? These are when you have damage to your auditory cortex and you have difficulty interpreting complex sounds. Okay? Everything's working fine with your sensory apparatus, you're getting the signals in, but once the signals come in, things are kind of screwed up, right? You're not able to interpret those. So that's sort of a different place.
Seriously. So is that having a one-on-one conversation now, you understand really well? I'm at an event with multiple people. I can't tune out the person talking here to the person talking here to the person talking here. So the same sound, or we're all kind of jumbles into the same area.
I mean, that's a fairly common phenomenon, right? I mean, it happens. That's definitely going to be related to your auditory streams, right? And there are a whole host, and you can ask JP about these. There are a whole host of theories about how you pluck out different auditory streams that we're not really going to get into in this class. But that is important, right? So how do you know when you're at a restaurant, what's the background music, what's the folks behind you having a conversation, the person in front of you that you should be listening to? You've got to pick out all of these different things, and you've got to, sort of an attention mechanism as well, right? Like auditory attention. But yeah, that was a good question, finally. Hey, sometimes it's great to process visual and auditory information together, right? So we can kind of have that. We're not going to like hear something and then go, I'm going to try to find, So when we hear like a loud noise, we're quite often going to try to orient to that, right? That's a pretty common phenomenon. So we're going to take that primary visual cortex information, that primary auditory cortex information, put that into some of those parietal lobes, get that information up to your cortex, your frontal cortex, so you can figure out where things are, what's going on. You really want to coordinate that audio-visual information, right? So you can kind of navigate around your world the best. For those of you that didn't pick up, this was a monkey brain, not a human brain. We briefly talked about the what versus where pathways when we talked about vision, right? In this case, we kind of have that same organization when it comes to the auditory cortex. If you want to think about what's the category, that's a blue, right? So that's a what. And if you want to think about the location, that's going to be where. So we can see that those are two separate pathways in the auditory system as well. We're going to decide what it is, and then we're going to try to figure out where it's located. Okay? We did the same thing with vision. We had a what pathway, what is that object, or what is that visual stimulus, and then where is it located, right? So both of those are important. We're not going to talk about perception of music, largely because it's a complex thing. I know some of you listen to music because we talked about the earbuds, right? I'm assuming not all of you are like doing news podcasts when you do that. And there actually are particular brain regions involved in the perception of music. There have been a ton of studies on those. Any questions about the auditory system before we move on to a slightly, an adjacent system there, the vestibular system?
Last week talking about vision, the fusiform face area, you said it develops, it gets bigger because you add faces to it. Okay.
Yeah.
The same thing happened for any particular place in the brain for sounds. If you add a list of sounds, obviously it's a lot less than faces you would see. But
sure. You're going to see some development, but again, because we don't rely as much on auditory, that is going to happen. There are folks who have brain damage, and they're unable to recognize voices, right? Is that what?
What about people who are blind or like blind?
Yeah. So rather, so quite often people will say things like, oh, well, I lost my vision and my hearing got better, right? Well, your hearing doesn't actually improve, right? You've just learned to rely on that, and you learned some, I don't really want to call them tricks. You've learned some new skills, right, to use like echolocation. You had those present now. Part of the reason is your hearing's not going to ever get better, right? Just as a heads up to like kind of, I know, right, like squash your dreams of getting better hearing. It's not going to happen, right? Because you're going to have this constant age-related kind of loss of hearing. And you're limited, right? Because you only have so many inner hair cells. Your cochlea is only so good, right? You might have some changes in cortex. We have some plasticity there, right, Alex? But we're not going to be able, if we have this, like, so we have visual cortex here. Okay, that's awesome. And let's say I lose my vision, Celine, and all of a sudden I decide, or I'm able to take that and expand it so that now that's all auditory cortex, right? Okay, so you think, well, I have more cortex to process, right? That's going to be helpful. The problem is you're still limited by that cochlea and those hair cells, right? So the input device isn't any better. Okay, it's like how many of you are into gaming computers? All right, Riley. So it's like, what if I gave you, I'm gonna set you up with a gaming computer, right? I'm gonna give you a giant, 4K curved monitor. It's got a beautiful refresh rate, right? We're talking about like a $2,000 to $3,000 monitor. But I'm gonna make you, huh? You bought one for $200. That's a deal. You've got this beautiful monitor, but I'm going to make you hook it up to a standard video card. You're going to kick me in the shins, right? That's pointless, right? And that's exactly what would happen here. So what if I give you a whole bunch of extra cortex if I'm not giving you the apparatus to drive that, right? If I'm not really giving you one of these, advanced, video cards that everybody was buying up to mine Bitcoin, it's not going to do you any good, right? So I got to give you the video card to go with it. So in this case, you've got to have the cochlea to drive that, right? And if you don't, then it's sort of useless. But Could be a slightly different story for folks who are born congenitally blind, right? So that's different than losing your vision too when you're like 40, right? So if you go blind as an adult versus being born blind, your brain's going to be organized differently because you're not going to have those inputs originally. So that's sort of a different thing to think about, which is kind of interesting as well. Did that answer both of your questions? All right. And then we know whose house to go to if you guys want to play Fortnite. You don't play Fortnite? My nephew asks me all the time. Huh? He's 11. Yeah, he'll be 11 like next week. So.
Yes.
Get him what?
PUBG.
Oh. All right, let's talk about the vestibular system. Okay? I want everybody to stand up, spin around in a circle, and then sit down. No. Just one. No, just make sure your vestibular system works. So, what is the vestibular system? It deals with balance. So that's awesome. It helps you maintain your head in an upright position, right? So most people, when they walk down the road, their head's upright. Most people don't walk with their head. I mean, some people do occasionally. But most of the time your head's upright. And it also helps you with eye movement. So how many of you have ever, I know you guys have all done this, right? Adriana, you're looking in the mirror and you're trying to, move your head around. Sure. And your eyes, they just, follow, you keep trying to, every morning, right?
Yes.
It's like,
Yeah, JP and I actually talk
got to
about
check
it a
my
lot.
ears.
Yeah.
We do it at the same time every day.
We like FaceTime each other.
FaceTime each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
you know what you can do with the FaceTime, right? Because then you could like hold it up and then she could give you
Yeah.
like a visual
That's what I'm
description.
saying.
That's
what
brilliant.
I'm saying. Yeah. Good morning.
My wife and I actually just moved, and our new bathroom has a medicine cabinet, and the medicine cabinet has like every single surface is a mirror, right? And so when I open it to brush my teeth, now because I get my toothpaste out, it's like I can see my head, like it's a really weird experience because I'm like, and you can like see like my whole face in profile, which is not something you get to do very often. I've learned that. And then I always thought, like, you ever see those like silhouettes of people, Cindy? And I think, well, that guy looks weird. And then I was like, well, that guy looks. Oh man, that's me. Guess everybody looks weird in profile. So, no worries, folks. So we want to think about the vestibular system. This is actually really cool. How many of you love gravity? Yeah, right, Alex? Because
My name's not Alex.
are you sure?
I promise. It's Kyle.
Kyle. Well, who's Alex?
You wrote the wrong
Brought the wrong sheet. It's not gonna help.
Yeah, but I really feel like there's nobody named Alex in this class either. There's not. I'm going to check on this.
Check it out. Are you sure?
It's Kyle James, right?
Yes.
Thanks for correcting me, though.
I was just gonna let it ride out, but you did it 2 times in a row.
No, you got to tell me. You really do, because I mean, it'd be like 5 years from now. I'll see you again, and I'll go, hey. Yeah, there's not a single Alex in this class. Or my other class. And I know in my third class there's not an Alex. I don't have an Alex at all. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
No worries, Kyle. We'll get it straightened out. All right, so gravity's awesome, so you don't fly off the face of the planet. But you sort of need to know where gravity's pulling you, right? Okay, you need to know this. You have to keep yourself oriented, so that's great. You have vestibular sacs. Don't those sound awesome? They actually respond to the force of gravity, and they're also going to give you information about your head's orientation, right? How many of you know when your head is not upright? Right, Sarah? I mean, this is an important thing. You know this, right? So you can correct that, okay? That's your vestibular system, right? So it knows about this more. This is more like static kind of things, right? For the most part, gravity doesn't change for you, right? It always pulls you to the same place, and that's the middle, right? The middle of the planet, okay? The only time gravity would really change for you is if you, become a billionaire and Elon Musk will shoot you into space. I don't see that happening to any of you soon, I don't want to say ever. I just say soon. Huh?
You don't know how.
I know, but you're a student, and I'm going to assume some student debt there, and like not a good job, and a few other things, right? I know things can explode later, and hold out for that. Right now, I don't think it's happening. If it is, remember that great professor you had for this class. Thanks. How many of you love to spin around in circles quickly in the air? No, not everybody likes that. Anybody gymnast? All right, we got a couple there. Yeah, that's great. We'll expect a demonstration next week. Your circular canals are going to be involved for your angular acceleration, right? So those rapid sort of turns and tumbles and so forth, right? So you're going to feel that. You have these 3 canals, and they're sort of organized at 90 degrees to each other, so you can be sensitive to rotation at all angles. It's kind of pretty exciting. All right, here you go. Those are your semicircular canals. Look how those guys are oriented in there. These are your vestibular sacs. Those are going to be your gravity sensors, right? Now, there are times where you can get really confused about this. Okay? How many of you, and I know you've all done this, you're probably going to do it when you get home, you've got an office chair that spins, and you'll just spin and spin and spin and spin and spin and spin, right? Celine, you probably do this every you do it at work. I'm not going to ask where you work because they're not getting their money's worth out of you. So you're going to spin and spin and spin, and then you stop, and then it feels like you actually start rotating in the other direction, right? That's really kind of weird. Why does that happen? It happens because, who remembers that jelly stuff, Chris? I know you're hungry. That was in the cochlea, right? We've got a similar substance, endolymph, same thing, and that's going to be in your semicircular canals. It's also going to be in your vestibular sacs. Right? So it gives a little bit of resistance to these things that are moving. So as you're spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning, you stop. There's still some momentum, right, that's going to move that endolymph around. You're going to think you're going the other direction. I like to think about it, sometimes you get a beverage, and you slide that beverage, and then what happens when you stop it? If you don't it sloshes, right? If you don't decelerate that, it just sloshes over, and you've spilled out your Kool-Aid or whatever's in there.
I've been watching some astronaut videos, so that's why I'm asking. How is no gravity like for astronauts? How does that impact this kind of thing?
Yeah, I bet that's exciting. It really screws up their vestibular systems temporarily. I mean, while if there's not gravity, you're not going to be your vestibular sacs are not going to work, right? Okay, because they're not going to be like pulling you down, right? So you're not going to feel that. So you're going to constantly kind of have this up and down. This is why they put them in the chair and they spin them and they rotate them around and try to make them vomit. Because if you are prone to vertigo, which is not height vertigo, that's a special version of vertigo. Like vertigo is just simply your vestibular system tells you one thing, your visual system tells you something else, and you're not able to reconcile that. If that happens to you, you're not going in space, because no one wants to be next to Old Faithful, because you're just going to be vomiting all the time.
I'll give an example of non-height. I know height vertigo.
Yeah, so the other kind of vertigo is simply, I mean, people will stand like this if they have vertigo, because they're, if you think about your vestibular sacs, instead of being oriented 90 degrees, if they're shifted a little, then you're going to want to tilt your body to accommodate for that. But your visual system's going to tell you the world is perfectly square, but I don't feel like it is. Gravity's pulling differently, and that's vertigo. So you're always going to be nauseous. You're going to be disoriented.
Yeah, my dog had that moment.
Yeah, it happens sometimes temporarily to folks who have inner ear infections. Certain medications will cause you to have this. There are, I used to work with a guy with Meniere's. If he had, I think that's what it's called, Meniere's disease. if he drank like half a can of Coke, the caffeine would give him vertigo. So it was, yeah, it was, it was kind of interesting. He was an interesting guy. So there you go. So Cindy, that was a great question. I don't know why you're on like an Apollo 13 binge watch, but that's okay. You know, there's some great astronaut movies out there. Apollo 13 probably being at the top of the list. But yeah, the vestibular system, the semicircular canals will still work because you can still rotate. This is why when you watch sci-fi movies, quite often you will see, you know, they'll have like a big thing, a circular thing that's going to like spin, right? So to create some artificial gravity, right? And so if you were walking here, put an astronaut helmet on this guy, right? And this thing were spinning in this direction. Because we all know, like when you spin things, how many of you have had a bucket of water on a rope and you just spun it around and then the water will stay stuck in there, right? You can go home and try this if you want. And so if it's constantly spinning, you'll actually create some like downward force, right? And so you could create sort of some, I wouldn't want to call it artificial gravity, but that's how it would feel to you, right? So you'd feel like you're pulling down. And so then you would feel like you had gravity and everything would be fine. You could walk around, do whatever. Sarah?
Why when you get vertigo, like, do you don't black out, but like your vision goes black?
Yeah, so again, you're getting two conflicting reports on the world, right? And the best thing to do is ignore one of them.
Okay. So it just kind of goes black.
So you can have some problems. You can also start to have nystagmus, right? Your eyes will start to move rapidly. They'll just kind of like twitch over to one side. Happens when you're drunk too. If you, it does. Not like when you're standing up and you're drunk, but if you can get someone to lie down when they're drunk, on their side, right? Then their eyes will just start to really move. You guys can try it the next time. It's not going to happen to you because you guys know the trick, right? But you could. And what I would recommend is like, you know, videoing that and putting it on YouTube. But what I would do, just for, you know, like their privacy, like just zoom in, like get right up to their face, because you don't want their whole face so we know who they are. We just want to see their eyes twitch. But you have to be drunk and lying on your side. Both things. Okay. What do we got going on here? These are your vestibular sacs. This is your, what we call it, the otolithic membrane. Otolithic is great. It means ear stone, right? Which is pretty cool, right? You guys have heard of Paleolithic, and well, now you know otolithic. So that's kind of cool. So these are ear stones. Those are what gravity is pulling downward. And again, we still have hair cells here. It's kind of the same as what we had in the auditory system. They're going to get deflected as those otoliths move in your vestibular sacs. Not a big deal. Here are a bunch of words that I've said. These are actually your vestibular sacs. These are actually parts of your vestibular sacs. I don't really need to know that. We already talked about this. Those hair cells are very similar to the ones that were in your cochlea. Here's actually kind of an interesting picture from the saccule, right? This is one of your vestibular sacs, so you can kind of see. This is actually from a bullfrog. I don't know why a bullfrog, they have interesting ones. But there you go, right? That's kind of cool. And you can see the way these are stacked from you know, short to long. Don't worry too much about this. These are one of your cranial nerves. It's got part that's going to handle vestibular information and part that's going to handle auditory information. Questions about the vestibular system? No? That's pretty good, right? That was Einstein's favorite system. I mean, he was so interested in gravity, why wouldn't he be? That's what I think. I mean, I'm just surmising that, but there you go. That or the visual system, because he was really interested in light as well, right? I don't think he cared about the auditory system. It's like those sound waves. Those are for other people. All right, somatosenses. What does soma mean? Soma means body. How many That was a bad question. That was a really bad question. I'm not going to ask. So you're going to ask, how many of you like to feel your bodies? And that wasn't what I. Yeah, we'll just skip over that. Please don't raise your hands. Or maybe I should say, please raise your hands. One of the two. So it's important to be aware of your body, what your body's doing, what's happening to your body, right? All joking aside, this is great. How many of you have ever had a parasite on your body? Yeah, like a lot of people, right? So don't be afraid to admit to that, right? So what is it? Think about like ticks. Anybody ever been out in the woods? You've had a tick crawling, right? I mean, it's a normal experience, right? What do you do with the ticks that are on your body? You just put them in your mouth and eat them. Just kidding. Don't eat them. True story. My father-in-law had Lyme disease last year. I think it was last year. Year before. They thought he was bitten by a spider, which it was an idiot doctor he went to, because it was like when you can type into Google Lyme disease or tick bite, and it's like that's exactly what you have. It looks just like your arm. And the doctor he went to, she apparently told him, "Oh no, I think that's a spider bite." And he like kept having these like weird fevers and had to go to the ER 3 times. Finally, they tested him for Lyme disease. He recovered. Just as a spoiler alert there, in case you were like holding out to see what happened to him. Let's just say this. He's back to the way he was. I was going to say he was fine, but he's back to the way he was before the Lyme disease. We'll go with it. Yeah. I would have said it about my father, too. It really doesn't make much difference. So Lyme disease is a serious thing, so watch out for that. Like, seriously. That's I know we're kind of past the peak of that, but a lot of folks like to still do outdoor activities this time of year, especially as it cools down just a little bit. You can get out and do some hiking. I would really recommend that you do that, right, Zane? I mean, that's a beautiful thing to do, especially as the leaves change and some of the wildlife comes out when it's not so hot. But please just, don't get Lyme disease. So that's why, how many of you have ever had an itch and you don't know what's there? You just like start scratching yourself. Happens all the time, right, Andre? That's great because you should periodically check to see if you have parasites on your body, right? And it's better to be just like a little sensitive to that than not, right? Because if you don't feel it, I mean, think about how small a tick is, right? They're like so little and they just like crawl like this, right? Like so slow, right up, and then they'll get right up to your ear and just, right? And then you've got, right in there. So you really need to be just a little extra sensitive to that, right? And you want to be like, it's better to like check an extra time to see if there's a parasite than to miss one, right? And so your threshold's going to be a little high, a little sensitive to that. That's okay, right? It's fine. Just take a look, see what it is. It's probably nothing, but then again, it could be something serious. This was especially true when we lived in an environment without two important things that can keep parasites off your body. One is obviously pesticides, bug repellents. The other is pants, right? So before pants were really like universally accepted as something cool, you can imagine like all of the extra parts of your body that are exposed, right, to the elements. So now that we have a lot of clothing and things, then we're okay. Mostly, but still check just in case. You never know what that is like crawling up your back. This reminds me of this time I had a needle in my sock. I don't know how a needle got in my sock, but like all day something was stabbing me in the toe. I was like, what is that? So I took my shoe off like 4 times, right? It was like in the 6th grade or something. I kept like taking off my shoe. It's like, I can't figure out what it is. And finally I was like, what's this silver thing at the end of my sock? And it was like a needle. Somehow I'd stepped on like a, like a pin, like a needle for sewing, like pinning things. I don't know. Thankfully it didn't go in.
I was thinking like a syringe.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Oh, no. That's likely now, but yeah, no, this was like a sewing needle. I should have specified. Yeah, I probably wouldn't. Yeah. Well, there you go. Watch out for those too. So, somatosenses, you got a bunch of these. We talk about the cutaneous senses. We're talking about skin, right? Okay, we talk about touch, tickle, things like that. Pain, temperature, those are all cutaneous. Those receptors are embedded in your skin. You have different types of receptors for each of those sort of modalities, right? For each of those specific things. Proprioception. This is where your body is and your posture. How many of you know where your feet are, but you don't see them? Right? That's because of proprioception. That's important, right? All jokes aside, there are some folks who don't have proprioception. They have damage to, somatosensory cortex, and they will have to actually look at their body parts to move them. Because if they don't look at them, they don't realize hey, that's actually my arm, and it's doing things. So that's kind of weird. Kinesthesia. This is your own movements. Very important to be aware of your own movements, right? If you don't believe me, just try to imagine moving through the world without knowing that you're moving, right? It becomes a very complicated thing to do. Finally, when we talk about somatosenses, body senses, there's a group called organic or visceral senses. Visceral means guts, right? These are things you're not typically consciously aware of. How many of you know what your blood pressure is right now? Yeah, nobody, right? How many of you know you have a blood pressure right now? Everybody has a blood pressure, right? But Cindy, you don't know what it is. Your body knows what it is. Now, it doesn't know that it's a number. Who cares what the number is? But it knows when your blood pressure is high or low. It modulates that, right? It knows how much oxygen is dissolved in your blood. It knows carbon dioxide, pH. It knows all of these things, right? Because we're sensing that. You're not aware of that. Your body just makes those changes, right? Those are still senses. It's still a sensory modality, but it's just not one you're working into your sort of experience of the world. What else do we have? We also have pain modification and pain sensitivity, right? So, how many of you have ever stumped your toe? Happens all the time. Felt some pain. That pain lessened, right? Some of that's because you're going to release these endogenous opioids, right? You create your own, so that's something that works. You've got a bunch of neural mechanisms that actually trigger this whole process to get these opioids released. And most of that action of those opioids is going to be down in your periaqueductal gray matter. Kind of interesting. Continuing to think about opioids, these guys are inhibitory. That makes sense, right? If your neurons that are sensitive to pain are activated because they're stimulated, right? They're going to feel some pain. If we were to inhibit the activity of those neurons, we would probably limit your sensation of pain. Now, just because we've eliminated your sensation of pain, that doesn't mean we've actually solved the problem, right? Okay. How many of you have ever had, you don't have to answer this, broken bone, an operation, something? They gave you some pain medication for that. You thought, wow, I feel a lot better. It didn't fix the problem, though. It just helps you deal with it, right? And so that's important. Sometimes it's important to feel a little bit of pain. Do you know why? So you don't do stupid things twice, right? When you do something that causes pain, it's because it causes tissue damage. If you do something that causes tissue damage, often enough, you'll die, right? And that's how that works. So you don't really want to cause tissue damage. So you want to kind of have that negative experience. So there you go. So we have neurons that are in part of the spinal cord in that gray matter. If you actually destroy those axons, morphine will no longer be effective, right? So if you give people, or probably wouldn't do it to people, you do it to a laboratory animal, you would create some pain, give them the morphine. If you've killed those axons, then they actually will not, they'll not have that analgesia. So that's kind of cool. Did we talk about placebo effects in this class? Okay, we'll talk about placebo effects just a little bit. These are actually kind of interesting. They do work. There have been some fMRI studies for placebo effects. If you expect decreased sensitivity to pain, you'll actually increase the activity of your prefrontal cortex, right? So if I tell you this is going to help reduce pain, that's going to activate your prefrontal cortex a little bit. It's going to have some connections there with that periaqueductal gray matter. And it's going to activate some of those endogenous mechanisms that are going to release the opioids and so forth, right? So you can do that. It works, right? Tell yourself, like, this is going to help reduce pain if I shuffle a deck of cards. It doesn't really matter what it is, right? As long as it's something and you're legitimately expecting a reduction in pain, right? Mothers figured this out a long time ago, right? When they, you know, like kiss your knee when you scrape it or something, right? It works. Here are a number of receptors that are buried in your skin. I'm not going to expect you to memorize all these different types of receptors, okay? Just know there are different receptors for touch, for vibration, for tickle, for pain, for pressure, for temperature, things like that, okay? Also keep in mind temperature. If it gets too hot or if it gets too cold, we'll actually start to feel that as pain. That's kind of interesting, right? That's cool. And there are actually different kinds of cool, right? How many of you have ever held an ice cube? Yeah, okay, so it's cold. How many of you have, and Sarah, we know you're in this group, had rubbing alcohol on your body? Yeah, so you can put rubbing alcohol on your arm, and what happens? It feels cool, right? Because it's evaporative, right? So it's evaporating. It's a different type of cool, but you can still sense that. Here's a chunk of skin. Everybody loves chunks of skin, right? You ever think about how much skin you've eaten in your life? See, there was some like gross response to that, but what about like chicken? How many of you eat chicken skin? There we go, right? Some skin on your fish. Stuff happens, right? So, these are just showing you different receptors embedded within your skin at different locations. Not a big deal. If you're interested, you can look at this chart and it'll tell you all the different types of sensory receptors. We've already talked about your cutaneous senses. We said you have touch, vibration, temperature, again, too hot or too cold, will cause pain, and then you have itch, right? Itch is a fun one. Itch keeps you parasite free. We talked about that, right? Your somatosensory pathways are sort of interesting. Some of them cross early, pain and temperature. Some of them don't cross over until later in your higher up in your spinal cord. That's going to be like touch and kinesthesia, right? So those are going to, they don't both cross at the same time, which is kind of interesting. Touch is going to use mechanoreceptors. You need to actually have some physical interaction with the world to feel touch, right? Again, temperature has two kinds. These involve free nerve endings, so these nerve endings don't have any kind of casing on them, right? There's nothing out there. They're just free and exposed, and that's great because if you want to feel pain, which you do, because remember, you don't want to do things that cause damage, you really want that threshold to be pretty sensitive, right? You don't want to wait and have to really have a lot of tissue damage to feel pain because you could just, you know, sit there while your hand's getting smashed, you know, for hours. You're like, well, maybe I'll wait a little bit longer, see if this is really pain or not. I don't know yet. Just see. And then, you know, you've got like a, you know, ruined hand. That's no good, right? You want to feel that early so you can make some changes in your behavior. Again, we've talked about these two separate pathways, the dorsal column for touch and kinesthesia, the spinal thalamic tract is pain and temperature. And remember, we said temperature similar to pain if it gets higher or low enough. Pain is a very complicated sort of event, right? There's this sensory event we've talked about, interaction between your nociceptors, that's what we call pain receptors, and whatever the stimulus is that's causing some tissue damage. You've obviously got some immediate emotional consequences. How many of you have ever been distressed when you felt pain? That's normal, right? I mean that's you can react to that in different ways behaviorally, but that feeling of distress is normal, and that's great. If you didn't have that, again, you would just sit and endure pain unnecessarily, and if your ancestors were like that, if they didn't get worked up about pain, you wouldn't be here, right? They're just like, oh, pain, that's great, bring it on. I don't, whatever, and people will say that, but in fact, they're still getting distressed, right? Don't think those people are, tricking you. Then we want to think about the long-term emotional implications of chronic pain. I think many of us know someone or have ourselves dealt with chronic pain, right? And we know the impact that can have on your life if you're dealing with this over and over again. It can be quite profound. There are different types of chronic pain. Obviously, there's chronic pain because there's some sort of peripheral issue that can be resolved sometimes it can't. There are also folks who have sort of central nervous system damage, right, to their parts of cortex that handle pain, and those folks, unfortunately, are not getting any relief, right? So if the pain is initiated in your brain and not elsewhere, we're not that great at treating that pain, and that's sort of difficult. As we talked about that spinal cord stuff, there are obviously things that we could do, things that we could do to treat, again, peripheral issues, spinal cord things. In the brain, if your somatosensory cortex is damaged, if you've got, I think it's called thalamic pain syndrome is one of these. This is long-term chronic pain that's not treatable, right? No matter what medications you take, we don't have a target for that. Here's some pathways of pain. Again, pain is a very complex phenomenon. We think of it quite simply, right? You hit your thumb with a hammer, that's going to hurt. But in fact, there are a lot of parts involved, again, because pain has such high survival value, right? If you were a species that didn't feel pain, the lifespan of the you'd have to evolve some other method of survival. We actually have a pretty extended lifespan as a species. There aren't a lot of, if you were to put us on the scale of things, there aren't many species who live longer than us. There's some species that live hundreds of years. That's a different story, but there are only like 3 of those. So we're pretty far up there when we're talking about living decades. Even if we're talking about sort of our natural lifespan, right? We've obviously artificially augmented that with things like medications and hospitals and some of the advanced things that we do. But even beyond that, I mean, you're thinking, 3-4 decades is a pretty long time for a species to live, right? If you look at most other species, they just live a handful of years. Even mammals, right? I mean, how long do you think a beaver lives? I don't see a lot of 40-year-old, gophers running around, right? It doesn't really seem to happen. So, but if we were, just living in our natural environment, 40 would probably be a pretty good life expectancy for us. That's about, if you don't brush your teeth, just as a heads up, they'll fall out when you're about 35. For most species, when your teeth fall out, that's when you die. What happens if there's a toothless tiger? It's dead, right? Tigers don't have toothbrushes, so it's a pretty good indicator that happens. Humans, if they didn't have toothbrushes, around 35, 40 years old is when your teeth would completely fall out, and you would probably cease to exist at that point. So there you go. That's a real uplifting story, right? Don't brush your teeth. Think about the money you'll save on taxes. Think you're gonna die? Yeah. Got a little bit of tartar growing up there. Probably a little bit of broccoli stuck in your teeth. See how many people I can get to stop smiling. The fastest.
How many am I gonna live forever?
Yeah, there you go. Have fun with that. You might. I don't know if I'd want to live forever. You ever think about that? Yeah. Too many of you annoy me. Questions about this? I think it's probably all right. Hey, who's heard of phantom limb? That's a thing, right? Yeah, yeah, it happens all the time to folks. And there's actually this guy, V.S. Ramachandran, who sort of came up with a good treatment, which is sort of an interesting treatment, for phantom limb syndrome. So what he would do is he had a box, and he would have someone stick their arm in the box, and then he had a mirror, and it would reflect. So if they stuck in their left arm, looks like it's your right arm in the mirror, right? And this person, let's say, doesn't have a right arm, right? So then what he could do is, whatever, right? You can stick in a fake arm. You can do whatever you want. What you could do then is if you're looking at that reflection and you're like, hey, maybe that's my arm, right? And then you can somebody can start scratching, let's say your hand itches, right? And they can scratch your left arm, but you're going to feel it like in your right arm, right? It's kind of interesting. And that's kind of a way to treat that phantom limb syndrome. There's a similar thing you can do with people who actually have both arms. It's called the rubber hand illusion, right? How many of you have volunteered at the Brain Expo? Anybody volunteered there? Yeah, Casey. Did you see the rubber hand illusion? It's the greatest station.
Here's the little, those little worms. Do you know what They're like glowworms. They're really cool.
Sounds exciting.
The kids thought they were.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I've not, unfortunately, been to that. I probably have. I have no idea. They usually make me run the rubber hand station, which is unfortunately, a complicated one. And I don't get to move around too much. But
There's really cool videos about it.
there are. And so what you could do is the setup that we use for that is like a lab coat with a fake hand, which is really kind of interesting. And so now, not now, but November's the best time to buy fake hands, if you want to know, because that's when all the Halloween decorations go on sale. In case you want to stock up on fake hands, right? You never know. So you have a fake hand. So the kid will sit down, and they've got their one arm there, and then what they do is they put the fake arm, kind of drape it over there, right? So they have like a real arm and a fake arm, and then they stick their real arm in a box, and they can't see their hand in that box, right? And what you will do is you have a paintbrush that's forked, and so you can kind of just move one and take the paintbrush down the real hand that they can't see and the fake hand, and when you do that enough, eventually they'll feel the paintbrush out there in the fake hand, and it's really a pretty exciting experience for the kids. They get a little freaked out sometimes, and which is kind of fun.
Well, and I like the videos too where they take a hammer
Yeah.
and they act like they're going to hit the fake hand
And people-
the person freaks out.
Yeah, that happens too. It's hard to do at the Brain Expo because it's a very kind of loud environment.
Yeah.
A lot of kids are jostling around, but occasionally you'll get a kid who will flinch back when you do that, which is actually pretty exciting. By the way, if you guys want a good volunteer opportunity, Brain Expo is coming up like in March, so keep put that on your calendar. We already talked about opiates and how they cause analgesia. They're inhibitory. Don't worry about it. Here are the areas that are involved in the placebo. So a lot of this is going out there in the anterior cingulate cortex and some of your prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, your nucleus accumbens gets involved. We'll talk more about the nucleus accumbens later when we talk about drug addiction. That guy's really involved in that process. I think this is a particularly interesting study that was done a number of years ago. They both of these were placebos, and they were measuring the strength of pain reduction here on some scale. Okay, and they were actually shocking people. So much fun so far, right? Because we're getting to shock people. That's exciting. We're telling them something will work that's not going to work. So that's exciting too, right? So we keep telling them, hey, this is whatever placebo you're taking. Let's see what works. Now what they do, so they're telling them you're getting this drug. It's going to reduce pain, and what you see is both of these reduce some pain. What's really interesting though is if we tell you that it was a low price drug, you don't think it works as well. as if it was a regularly priced or higher priced drug. So there you go, right? You don't have to answer this. How many of you buy name brand toothpaste and not the store brand toothpaste because you don't think it'll work as well? Even though, JP, it's the same toothpaste, right? Probably. You're not even willing to.
You don't know
You don't know
for sure.
for
Have
sure.
you mass spec'd it? You don't know.
You don't, but I'm going to assume they're probably the same.
I don't know, Kretz has kept me pretty solid
They're-
the past 26 years.
Way to go. Keep up the good work. So, I just think this is really interesting. Shows you sort of the the effects of placebo. I don't know. You could start doing this, right? Like on your friends, save some money, buy cheap stuff, put it in an expensive container. You know, nobody's thinking about this. How many of you have like cheese parties?
Sorry?
What?
Cheese-
Cheese party.
Yeah, wine and cheese parties, right? Don't buy expensive wine. Buy an expensive decanter. And then buy cheap wine and put it in the expensive decanter and tell them
Well, that's just a really terrible hangover way to act.
they're not staying the night. They're going home. I don't care what happens to them.
Well, I'm going to drink too.
That's their problem. Yeah, well, you've got your own bottle. You can hide that. You guys need to learn some hosting tips. Yeah. So there you go, right? I mean, that's... How many of you have known someone who thought they were drinking an alcoholic beverage?
Oh my gosh.
Right?
It's the funniest
It
thing.
happens, right? And people try to do things. Some of it is them just acting, but some of it is, you want to think about placebo effects, right? Things like that get involved. It's interesting. So here's what you should do. The next time you have like a knee operation, anybody got one planned?
I do, actually.
You do?
I'm getting cortisone shots.
So what I would recommend is, well, you don't need those. Just tell yourself they work. Like get some, yeah, I don't know. What's Shaq selling lately that deals with pain? Just get some of that and put it in an expensive bottle and some icy hot and say, well, this is as good as cortisone. See if it works.
Will do.
Robitussin? I think that's for a different problem.
You just rub it in anywhere. It helps. If you think it helps, it helps.
Yeah.
Don't look at
That
me.
is true. That is true. Hey, who wants to talk about gustation? For those of you who don't know, this is taste. So, in case you didn't know this, Zane, here's another obvious one. For a substance to be tasted, it actually has to be dissolved in the saliva in your mouth. I know, right? This is profound. Yeah. And it's actually got to be the molecules, right? Those molecules have to interact with those taste receptors that are located on your tongue. Not a big deal. There are all kinds of different tastes. As of yet, we've sort of identified 6 qualities of taste, right? There's sort of 6 qualities. There's another couple maybe hanging out there we're working on, which is kind of really interesting. So if you think about this, you want to think about sweet, right? That's an obvious one. Sour. Okay, that's pretty cool. You've got bitter. Salty. That's pretty cool. You've got umami, which is savory, right? Anybody know the 6th one? Yeah, spicy, right? So how spicy is it? So how hot? So we're spicy. That's sort of the other dimension there, which is sort of interesting. There's another sort of taste receptor that may have been discovered recently. They're still working this out, which is kind of interesting. It's for like bread. I know it's kind of like a weird one. It's like a carbohydrate. So it's just a carbohydrate sensitive taste receptor, which would make some sense that we might have that, right? I mean, you've got one For sourness, you're really testing how acidic is it. So you're looking for like hydrogen ions, right? So what's something that's sour? Lemons, right? High in citric acid. Okay. Sweet, we're definitely looking for glucose there, right? So think about things that taste sweet. Your soft drinks, for example. Saltiness, sodium, what we're looking for. Okay. Savory is going to be like glutamate. So there's an amino acid. Interestingly, bitterness is typically from plant alkaloids. Which is kind of interesting. Most things that are really bitter are poisonous. That's pretty cool, right? It's just convenient, right? No, it's not convenient. It's called evolution. They taste bad because they are bad for you. Okay? If it tastes good, it is good for you. That's that simple. The problem is when somebody... Hold on, Chris. The problem is when someone has bypassed that natural setup, and instead of here for sweet, we're thinking about apples. Instead of apples, we're thinking about apple pies. Right? That's a different story. Apples are cool. Apple pies? Yeah, they're a lot cooler. They're also a lot more diabetic, right? So if we're trying to like put that on the diabetes scale, Wilfred Brimley's going to tell me apple pies, a lot worse.
Have you heard anything about cilantro tasting like soap to some
It's a G.
Yeah, it
I
tastes
have
like
it.
soap to me. You too?
Yeah.
Oh, JP.
Yeah. We're soul sisters.
You guys can do. The next time you're looking at each other's
Yeah.
like side view faces, you can like
Right.
use cilantro to scrub them. I don't know.
Have you heard about that?
No,
Really?
cilantro doesn't really get on my radar much.
No.
Yeah,
It's
like the one
it's a fad like
Yeah,
pesto.
there was like a study on that, right? Like, I was so,
It is pretty-
My mom would not believe me. I was like, it tastes like soap.
Are you going to participate in the study?
No.
Oh, that's bad. I mean, if you're one of the people, hey, speaking of that, you want to hear an interesting story about some magic berries?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting story. So once I ate a magic berry. This is a good story. So, no, there's like a berry producing. I was going to say a berry bearing, but that seemed a little confusing. Yeah, because it bears berries. But it's a bush. I think it's native to southern Africa. It has these berries on there. They're kind of these like red elongated berries. But if you can buy them, there's a guy in Florida. There's always a guy in Florida who sells these things, right, Casey? So there's this guy in Florida. You can contact him, and I think he's still in business. I mean, he may have relocated. It's like on the dark web or something. So you order these berries, and he'll send them to you. And then you can have like a berry party, right? So you just invite a bunch of people over. And so interestingly, we did this when I was in graduate school. So we all went over to my PhD advisor's house. So there was like a responsible adult there. Wasn't him, but somebody else. So we all had these berries. And so what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to put this berry in your mouth. And just leave it there, right? For like some extended period of time, like a few moments.
I know what you're talking about. I have them in pill form.
Oh, they come in pills?
Yeah.
Huh.
From Amazon.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. We had a party too.
So you put these, back in my day, you used to have to get it in the berry form. So you would get the berry, and then what you would do is you would start eating things that were sour or bitter, right? And it would supposedly taste sweet. So you could go in and eat like pickles, and they would taste like strawberries, pickled okra, just like anything that was kind of sour or bitter was supposed to, it was really kind of an interesting experience, I guess. So speaking of people who think cilantro tastes like soap, I was the only person at the party it didn't work. I tried it twice. I got 2 berries. I took a double dose just to give it a try, and nothing happened. It was like biting into pickled okra. My face was doing that 'cause it was nasty.
I'm sorry. It's really awesome.
It was kind of sad. I don't know why it didn't work, but I was a little disappointed. So there you go. you guys want to contact a guy in Florida to get some magic berries. Yeah.
Why do some things like taste different to other people? Like, people like Chips Ahoy cookies, but if I take a bite of it, it's like so salty I can't stand it. I don't know why. Everybody else is like, you're insane, they're not salty, but
Yeah.
they really are.
No, they're all right. I don't know what
They
your
are
problem
salty.
is.
She's with me. It tastes like
She's not even in the right class. I wouldn't listen to her. It's just going to be, I think it goes exactly back to the cilantro soap story. It's all going to be, so I sort of skipped over a slide here, with like receptors, different receptor types. You've got genes that code for these receptors. Some can be shaped differently than others. They're going to be sensitive to different substances, and so things can taste differently to different people. This is one of many reasons why there are different taste preferences. There are other reasons as well, right? What you've adapted to over time, what's culturally acceptable to you to eat, right? Things like that. But there are definitely going to be receptor issues as well, and that's all going to go back to the DNA that's coding for those proteins. It was a good question. Interesting story about soap. What? It was. Thanks for paying attention. You've got these papilla all over your tongue. Hey, this is something. You guys have tongues. I'm not going to draw a picture of a tongue. I was trying to do that and didn't think that'd work. You've got a tongue. Guess what? You've got taste receptors all over it, right? So that like bitter in the front and sour in the back, or whatever, the mullet of taste, I don't know what it is. That's not true. So, you can just stick sour things wherever and you're going to taste it all over. So that would be really bad, right? I mean, like, if you were going to do that, you should put like bitter on the tip, right? Like if you were going to do this, because then you could just like lick something to see if it's poisonous. So give it a little test. If you were going to do that, but we didn't, so don't worry about it. This is the tongue, so just imagine this extends like however far back in your mouth your tongue goes. You've got these papilla inside of that, right? You have taste buds. Taste buds contain multiple taste receptors, okay? So inside of this, all of these sort of little pieces, I'm going to draw the cell bodies in there. These are all taste receptors. Now what's interesting about this, so this guy might be salty, and this guy might be for sweet. Here's one for sour, bitter, whatever. You're going to have multiple taste receptors in each of those buds, right? So that you can send that information, whatever that is, back to your gustatory cortex. For those of you interested in cilantro and or soap and their taste, this is a slide that shows you the structure of taste receptors, some of the things that can get altered, these different, where the different things bind. So here we're thinking about glucose. If it's a sweet receptor, glutamate, that would tell us about things that are umami. It's umami. That's actually the Japanese word for savory. It was Japanese researchers who characterized that particular receptor. When we want to taste things in the gustatory system, or when we taste things, multiple receptors are being activated simultaneously, right? It's not like we taste something and, whoa, that was just sweet. It has other elements to it, right? And the combination of which of those receptors are active at any time gives you sort of the flavor. In addition to some other things like texture and smell are going to play roles as well. Don't worry about the cranial nerves. Interestingly, taste does not have a crossover, right? So before we talked about vision, we talked about the auditory system, somatosensory system. They all have some decussation, right? What happens on the left side of your body is handled by the right hemisphere of your brain. Okay, that's not true for taste. Because your tongue's sort of right in the middle, right? Why bother crossing that over? It doesn't make any sense. Now, when we get to gustatory cortex, what's really kind of interesting on this, you can follow this pathway if you want. Interestingly, taste also goes to places like the amygdala. We'll talk about that later. The amygdala is the fear nucleus. We'll talk about something called conditioned taste aversion, right? How many of you have a restaurant in town you will not eat there anymore? Because yeah, there you go. Sydney's got one. You don't have to tell us what it is, but after class I'd like to know which one made you sick. So I'm sure you all have a food, a substance, a place where you will no longer eat, or you won't eat it because you ate it one time and it made you sick, right? Some of you may have a long list of that, Celine. It looks like you have this folio you pull out and you're like, well, I can't eat at any of these particular places. I've had bad experiences. At that point, you just start cooking at home. Yeah, there you go. So we're going to be concerned about that. Why is it things that you eat are important for survival? If you continue to eat things that make you sick, you will die, right? If you eat something and it makes you vomit, guess what? Don't eat it again, okay? You want to learn that quickly so we get that info out to the amygdala. When we get into gustatory cortex, previously we had talked about things that were retinotopic, things that were tonotopic. We didn't really talk about somatotopic, but there's a map of your body sort of on your somatosensory cortex as well, Chiquilla, right? So we have all these well-organized maps for the sensories, and it's not just jumbled, right? Because we want to know location is important, right? For the gustatory system, location's not very important, right? So there's no overarching organization to the gustatory cortex, right? It's all just kind of mixed. Whatever, there's a little patch that handles, different tastes, all just sort of mingled in here together. There's not any real, rhyme or reason to this. Okay? So no organization. All right. Who wants to talk about the olfactory system? How many of you love to smell things? Guess what? We smell smells. Just in case just keeping up the theme here. Just letting you stay tuned in. Just like the gustatory system, the olfactory system, we're going to call it a chemical sense. We call it a chemical sense because we are really sensing chemicals, right? When we talked about the gustatory and taste, we talked about salt. We talked about sodium. We talked about plant alkaloids. We talked about things that are chemicals, right? And glucose. We're testing these. Smell is the same way. We're still smelling chemicals. So the molecules, whatever it is you smell, little pieces of that, little molecules, are up your nose. So that's always a pleasant thought. How many of you have a dog or a cat? I'll let you guys finish that thought. Think about keeping your house a little bit cleaner. What's interesting about this is you have like 6 million olfactory cells in this thing called the olfactory epithelium. And you are constantly producing new receptors there, right? It's like one of the only places in the adult brain where you're constantly producing new brain cells, olfactory epithelium, right? These guys get damaged, they're exposed, you're going to make new ones, you're going to replace the ones that are in there. Constantly happening. Again, it is a chemical sense. These chemical senses came along first. If you start to think about some of the first organisms to evolve, they were organisms that lived in an aquatic environment, right? How many of you have ever been in an aquatic environment? Well, we all were because we were floating around in an amniotic sac at one point. Most of you don't remember that. How many of you have ever been in water? Okay, yeah. So when you're down in that water, and I'm going to put you pretty deep in the water, right? You're definitely going to be relying on your vision and your hearing, right? Because those are so great underwater. Well, they're useless to you, right? You open your eyes underwater, what can you see? I don't know. Nothing. What can you hear? That's useless to you. But guess what? You can taste stuff. Open your mouth and take a big gulp. I wouldn't recommend that. Yeah. But if you were a fish can't see to save their lives. You know what they can do to save their lives, though? They can detect chemicals in the water, right? And they can use those chemical detections to go about their business, right? That's how this works. So these chemical senses were the first to evolve, and then later we evolved other things. I don't recommend getting in public pools. I don't know if anybody ever been in a public pool. Nobody's going to own up to that now after I told you don't get in, right? The reason is it's like taking a bath with someone. And there's like a really short list of people that I'm going to take a bath with. And none of them are at the public pool. I will assure you of that. It's like a very short list. Like those are people with which I will bathe. And most people are not on that list. Just, you got your own pool, that's fine. You know, let the people in there you're willing to take a bath with. That's fine. You know, have a bounty. You're not on the list. I'm sorry.
But even with like chlorine and stuff, it's still. Man, I think swimming gets a wreck 3 times a week. I'm like, ugh.
There you go, Riley.
I'm a lifeguard in the summer and I actually clean my public pool. And it's,
No one knows.
if you actually listen to the thought of it, it's not like after a whole day, like 5 minutes.
Yeah, there you go, right? Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Anytime. We're always here for, you know, that's a PSA, right? Public service announcement. Don't take a bath with random people. The chlorine is helpful, I'm certain, but
Not that much.
I mean, how many times do you hear about people getting infections from pool water? Yeah, all the time, right? Guess how many times I've had an infection from pool water? 0. Yeah.
Hot tubs too.
Hot tubs are worse. I mean, you know the best way to grow bacteria? Heat it up.
Yep.
Just
Hot tubs are just
boil that on up, and then you'll pass out while you're in there. It's like, that's a bad idea. This is a bad idea waiting to happen. Hot tub. I don't know. Hey, but what about that olfactory sense, right? It really helps to identify edible and spoiled foods. What's the first thing you do when you pull something out of your refrigerator? You smell it, right? I mean, constantly. And then what do? You ask somebody else to smell it, just to see if it's good. It's like, look, if one person thinks it doesn't smell good, just throw it away. I mean, that's just move on, right, Zane? I mean, I always tell people that a sign of adulthood is when you will throw food away before the expiration date because you know it's not good, right? Another sign of being an adult is actually looking at expiration dates. I know they're not, you know, there are problems with expiration dates, I understand that, but perishable, we call them perishables for a reason. If you wait too long and eat them, you will perish. That's the name. So we want to make sure something's edible and it's not spoiled, right? So you'll smell something. Olfaction's really good at that, right? How many of you have not, you were walking, let's say, to your car, and let's say you park at the stadium, and you walk by, and let's imagine it's not Fat Patty's, but a different restaurant, and you were to have an odor waft out of there that was a good, enticing odor, and all of a sudden you were hungry, right? Has that ever happened to anybody? Yeah, you're not hungry, and then all of a sudden you smell food, and you're like, wow. I actually think today's National Cheeseburger Day. I don't know how these things get on the calendar. Seems like a waste of time, but you can eat a cheeseburger whenever you want, right? But you smell a cheeseburger, and you're like, wow, that's really, you know, you're outside at the park, somebody's barbecuing. Like, wow, I'm hungry all of a sudden. I think that's my family reunion. So olfactory sensation, really great for that. There are these volatile substances, these molecules, right, that have to fly off of whatever that is, right? They have to fly off and you have to get them up in your nose, okay? I know, it's a little gross, right? But you've been doing it your whole life, so don't worry about it. You've got those 6 million receptors, you've got those 2 little patches of mucous membrane, not a big deal, right at the top of the nasal cavity. Now, all of these, so here you go, this is your nose. Here's your olfactory epithelium right there. Okay. You're going to collect and grab those molecules. Those receptors are going to be activated. They're going to send information up. Eventually, to your olfactory bulb, right, which is this sort of bit of tissue that's kind of hanging out right there. It's going to receive this olfactory information and then send that into your brain. If you were a rat, your olfactory bulb would be like this big compared to your head, because they primarily rely on their olfactory sense, right? Their visual cortex, instead of being this big, is like this big, okay, because they're not a visual species. So how do we detect specific odors? This is pretty awesome, right? We only have, you know, a limited number of types of receptors for olfaction, right? Maybe, you know, just a few, not a lot. But guess how many odors you can identify? If you're really pressed to it, you can identify about 10,000 odors. That's pretty impressive, right? Considering there aren't 10,000 receptor types. But what you do is you make combinations, right? So if you think about, let's say you had 5 receptors, just for example, how many combinations, and I don't really care if you use all 5 of these, right? You can use 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, doesn't matter. How many combinations can you make just using 5 receptor types? You can make a bunch, right? You've got 5 right off the bat, 6 if you use all, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, right? I mean, so you see all the ways you can combine these receptors. So you can have a limited number of receptors, but a massively expanded number of odors that you can identify if you're combining the receptor activation. Hey, guess what? We're going to send that information up to the amygdala and the hippocampus as well. Why would we do that? That's going to be important again for, let's imagine briefly that we are a rat. You know, one of the things that will scare a rat to death. So how many of you are excited about Halloween? That's coming up. How many of you don't have kids in your neighborhood, but you have cats and you want to, or rats and you want to scare them? You can just spray them with cat urine, right? That's very frightening to a rat. Why? Because guess wherever there's cat urine, there's a cat. And guess what cats do? They eat rats, right? And that's kind of the process. Okay. You want to be able to remember that. There are odors that you're afraid of as well, right? I mean, there are things you can smell. You know, if you had a traumatic experience with a fire, right? If you start to smell smoke, that can cause some sort of you know, experience for you. Not a big deal. Also, some information may go to the hypothalamus. Why might odor information go to the hypothalamus? Huh? JP, you've got a no answer? No answer. The hypothalamus is involved in hormones, right? And there are certain sort of interesting things we'll talk about in a few chapters related to things that you might smell that can activate hormones, right? So if you want to think about, we're not going to talk too much about pheromones. And there's some debate about whether or not they work with humans or not. How many of you have considered purchasing pheromones to attract a mate? They sell these. Same guy in Florida who sells those berries. You can go down and buy some pheromones. I would say save your money, because saving your money will help attract a mate. Buy toothpaste. That's a good use of money. Toothpaste, clean teeth.
Name brand.
Name brand toothpaste. But having, you know, this is sort of a shallow sort of thing to say, but having money will help attract a mate. I mean, that's just.
So like the smell of money is like one of those that activates hormone.
You think the smell of money will activate hormone? Possibly that'll work. But in mice, you can actually kickstart them into their what we call the estrous cycle, which is the same thing as the menstrual cycle if you were a human, which some of you are. It's the same thing. It's that you know, sort of fertility cycle. But you can kickstart that if they smell urine from a male mouse. So there you go. If you ever just want to like, hey, I think I'm going to, you know, kickstart my menstrual cycle, just visit a truck stop. Go in and smell the urinal, a good one. Get you started. That's a surefire. Any of you shouldn't be, but if any of you are trying to have kids, want to increase your fertility, spend a lot of time in a truck stop smelling the urinal. Then when you come home to your mate, I guarantee you, increase in fertility. Which I think it's going to be the opposite, but see how that works. Here you go. These are your olfactory receptors. They all feed up into something called a glomerulus. Don't worry too much about that. And then they go to these mitral cells. Anybody Catholic or a chess fan? You don't have to answer either of those. Some of you might be both, right? Why is it important if you're Catholic or a chess fan? They call it a mitral cell because it's shaped like a bishop's mitre. There you go. That's a bishop. That's the kind on the chessboard. Not the kind in hot water right now. It's a different kind of bishop. So, just to let you know, this bishop's okay. These guys will, they'll have those hats. How many of you have heard of the mitral valve in your heart? Same story. It's shaped like a mitre. Not a big deal. How many of you have heard of a miter cut?
Like on a quilt?
I suppose. I was thinking in woodworking. It's like an angled cut, right? So you have like an angle on the hat. So we're thinking about a miter. Does that work? Same thing. Hey, remember that time I told you about that combination business with receptors and so forth? Here you go. Here's your molecule. Look how it can activate these combinations of receptors, and we know that it's a different odor, right? So we can really activate multiple receptors, gives us that sort of extra sensitivity, even though we only have, in this case, we're only showing like 4 receptor types, but look at all the different combinations of activation. It's more than 4 different odorant molecules, right? It's called combinatorial processing, which is actually kind of cool. How many of you have a bike lock that has a combination on it? No, you guys know the bike locks I'm talking about? Chris, it's got like the 4 digits, right? And you got to spin them. And yeah, so they're like, how many digits are on yours? 4. So it's like 0 through 9, right? So it's like 10 digits over 4 spaces, right? So if you think about that, that's like 10,000 different possible combinations with just 4, right? So you could, if you want to steal Chris's bike, you could go through all 10,000 possible permutations of his combination, provided he doesn't change it before he figures out you're probably not going to do it all at once, right? 10,000 it's a lot to test in one day.
I didn't ride my bike today, so it's not sitting up there.
Yeah, that is kind of weird. I mean,
no,
your bike lock is doing you 0 help right now.
Yes.
It's like in your bag. It's like, hey, I got my bike lock here. Where's your bike? I think that's it. All right. Who's got questions about the olfactory system? No one?